Speaking of the exhibition, I strongly urge everyone to attend this exhibition. Obviously, more details about this will be given later on by Stephen. I must thank the judges, obviously, for their contribution. Christopher Azzopardi, who was the lead judge, Alex Attard, Charles P. Azzopardi, Gottfried Catania, Joe Smith, Pauline Grek, Ramon Sammut, DP Attard, and Charles Grishti. As I always do every week, I want to remind you also about the model photo shoots that are being organized. These are being organized models from ETM, Malta, and Gozo. It's European Top Models, an agency run by Nellas Photography in Malta. Very soon, they will be having another shoot. More details will be given in the coming weeks in future webinars. This is an excellent opportunity for those who love people shooting to train yourselves in how to work with models, posing, placing of hands, lighting, etc. It's a good opportunity. A couple of thanks, as usual, to the people who support me in these webinars, namely Stephen Bohajar, my right-hand man, for his ongoing support in planning and discussing these webinars. Josef Mifsud for his technical assistance and for streaming live our webinars. I remind those new ones who are joining us today for the first time that these webinars are being recorded and also are being streamed live on the Facebook page of the Malta Photographic Society. I want to thank, obviously, the EXCO of the Malta Photographic Society for supporting these webinars, and also the Facebook page admins for promoting our webinars on their Facebook pages, namely Tony Azzopardi from Fotografija Bejn il-Ħbieb, Alexander Kutajer from Photography Shots, and Johan De Bono from All Photography. Thank you very much. So I hand over to Lewis. Is Lewis here, Stephen?
Let me check. It seems he's not here today.
He's not here. Okay, then I hand over to you for your message on behalf of the society.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you all for attending and joining this webinar. As Vince was saying, we are very happy as an EXCO for last week's judging. Vince already thanked all the 9 judges. They did a very good job. They had more than 430 images, prints and images submitted by 43 authors, from which they chose the winners and also the ones that are going to be exhibited at Palazzo della Sal between the 6th and 26th of November. The exhibition is going to feature over 200 photographic works by over 40 local photographers. This year's exhibition, one will find 90 framed prints, divided into 50 color prints and 40 black and white, with 124 digital images which are going to be loop projected on a large monitor at the same premises. Later on, as a committee, we will inform our participants and members how can they do to attend and visit this exhibition. At the moment, the Society is also discussing to launch its first online photography course for beginners. This is an attempt, our first attempt, which we are planning to start in January. The beginner's course in photography has been amended to cater for those who wish to do an online basic course in photography. I would like to thank also Mr. Aron Tanti as our guest today. I've known Aron for these past, I think, 18 years, since both of us used to work as colleagues at Il Liceo. Aron is still there, but I have moved 10 years ago. Aron is passionate about bird photography. I remember him also at that time. From his own words, it was quite natural for him to develop a particular passion for birds, as in the past, he used to go hunting and trapping for birds with his relatives. But at one point, he realized that with his hobby, he was hindering what he loved most. So eventually, he decided to change the medium, and instead using a gun, he decided to use his camera. Starting from, I remember buying a Canon camera. He still uses Canon, but from a very small one. Nowadays he invested in lenses and other um, uh, lenses and apparatus to capture these beautiful creatures. His photography is used by many local bird societies, journals, and other educational resources. Now, I would like to pass the microphone to Vince again, and then we will hear what Aron is ready to share with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for that introduction. Obviously, you've introduced Aaron. Um, uh, I follow Aron as well. He's got excellent photography in nature photography and birds photography, particularly. What I want to remind everyone before I pass over the microphone to Aron to start the webinar is that, first of all, those of you who would like to ask any questions can obviously use the chat, send the questions on the chat to me, and I will, at periodic intervals, I will stop Aaron and I will ask the questions on your behalf so that we will have just one microphone and not having too many sounds. Um, um, also, we've introduced something new about the polls. You will be seeing a poll running up so that we will ask the audience for some feedback and we will share it with obviously the artist regarding some questions as we go along to create a healthy discussion. So you will see a poll and I will ask you to participate. The more we have, obviously, the more we can build up a discussion points, sort of. Okay, so over to you, Aaron. I've opened your mic. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Vince. Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. So, first of all, I would like to thank you for your.
I've lost the mic. Oh, say okay.
All right, I should be back now. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you. I I am extremely fond of birds, but for the years, photography became my other passion because without photography, I was not able to enjoy what I love so much. These feathered creatures that have been accompanying me since I was a little child. But as Stephen already mentioned, I used to enjoy birds differently when I was younger. I used to go out basically since I can remember in our countryside with my late grandpa. He was a passionate bird trapper, and the way I was brought up enjoying birds in a very particular way. At a certain point in time, I realized that was not the way forward, and therefore I started thinking about alternative ways how I can enjoy these creatures. But first of all, who is Aron Tanti? I am a computing teacher, basically. Many of my friends who know me from outside school think that I teach something related to the environment because the environment is my passion. It's something that I love. I also love technology, information technology, computing, programming, and therefore, basically, I have two parallel lives: a computing aspect and birds. Nowadays, when I say birds and photography. Thanks to my two parallel interests, I try to link them together in order to achieve a better goal. I try to use the technology available to reach more people, to share my efforts with more people, and also to learn more. it's a journey, basically. As you all know, photography is a journey that allows you to constantly improve. Why birds? As I said, the birds have been in my life since I was a young boy, but photography gave me the opportunity to capture a moment in time. For me, photography is not something, a tool that helps me create a moment. It is a tool that helps me capture, freeze a moment in time. Sometimes I spend hours waiting for a couple of seconds of enjoyment. Sometimes you wait in vain, but then on other occasions, you might get lucky. But it's just usually for just a very short period. So all that wait for a couple of seconds, for me, it wasn't good enough. I wanted a tool which I would be able to enjoy that instant for a longer period, and also to be able to share my captures with others, so as to help increase the environmental awareness as much as possible into my friends, my relatives, etc. And therefore, the link, the marriage between photography and birds, for me, it came out to be a very effective link, which now is about over 2 decades old, basically. Regarding my photographic equipment, photography for me is not a job, it is a hobby. And as such, I try to limit the budget, my budgeting, as otherwise, obviously, as you all know, there is no end in in what a photographer can buy nowadays. And basically, the list you're seeing there is the gear, the kit that I usually use. I have two bodies, the 80D and the 600D. The 80D is basically on constantly with the 400 prime lens, the 5.6, but then I use the 600D with the zoom lenses, because sometimes, even though usually I don't find the need, I don't request the need for a zoom, because in bird photography usually you eager for more zooming power, but sometimes we do have huge flocks and when of birds, and when you are using a fixed prime lens such as the one listed there, yeah, it would be very restrictive, because you will not be able to fit in all the birds in the flock. Therefore, sometimes I switch to the 700, 7300, and the 18135 usually is there in my bag, not for birds, but for insects, for flora, wild flora. Because even though I go out looking for birds, that is my main reason, the main reason why I'm out and about. Usually when birds are not around, butterflies and wildflowers somehow become much more effective. So I end up, when birds are not around, I end up appreciating more the floral and biodiversity and the insects that are available. And with the 400 millimeter, it's basically very difficult to capture. So I switch to the other lenses. But otherwise, for birds, most of the time, I tend to stick to my 400 millimeter lens. The photographic equipment is essential, but there is also some more essential equipment that I usually carry around, which is not strictly photographic kit. For example, a good bird guide. Regardless how much you know about birds, there is always that question that might crop up when out in the field. Birds tend to have quite the same species of bird tend to have quite a number of different plumages that it might have throughout the year. And sometimes we are not used to see a particular species in a particular plumage. For example, we might be familiar in Malta with a particular species in the winter, but it's not frequent in another season. And hence, when that particular species visits us in another season, not within the regular time frame that we are used to the species, usually it might have a different plumage, a plumage that we are not familiar with. Therefore, having a good bird guide make your session even more interesting because you would be aware of which species you are capturing. A good pair of binoculars is also very helpful, especially when you are for example, in a wood and the birds are hopping around in the trees, in the tree canopies, and you might check the bird out so that if it's a bird that is different from the ones that you have already captured, you might decide to sit down and wait for maybe a chance to get a better view of that particular bird. Some sort of bird hide, this is a point which I will be dealing with in the next slide. Comfortable seating, sometimes it takes a long time to get a good shot of a particular species. Sometimes it might take hours to get a better view of an uncommon bird, a particular bird. Therefore, a comfortable cushion in my bird bag is a must, because sitting down for 10 minutes, 15 minutes on a cold piece of a cold stone might be okay, but when the wait gets longer, it might become a problem. An inconspicuous cap, it is very important, as much as possible, to hide your face. Notice when you are walking out in the street and there are sparrows around, how they react when you stop and look at them. Experience showed that when you stop and stare at a bird, usually that bird would fly off. It is afraid of anything staring at it. Therefore, using a cap and hiding your face behind the camera, it should minimize the risk of the bird becoming afraid of your interest by staring through your staring. Therefore, using a cap and hiding your face behind your camera should help. And also, obviously, inconspicuous clothing, going out in the countryside looking for birds in, for example, blue or white or red or orange, you would be sighted by the birds from afar, and it is not recommended. Obviously, you don't need to go out in camouflage gear. You can wear pastel-colored clothing, which should do the trick quite perfectly. As I said, I mentioned hides, but it's very important to be aware that there is no one type of hide. You can obviously buy ready-made hides, which are pop-up hides, like the one seen up here in the top left corner, which are more or less around 120, 150 euros. They are not cheap, but they are very good. They are waterproof, they are quite portable, etc. I have a homemade hide, thanks to my wife. We made a homemade hide made up of conduit pipe and canvas, some canvas bought from a local store, and it is very similar to the one over here, shown here in the lower left corner. I also sometimes use a screen, which is basically not a hide, but just two poles and some canvas. That might do the trick, especially if you are against a wall or against the tree, the vegetation. On the right-hand side over here, there is another alternative that one might consider. It is basically a hide that you simply throw. It's a throw-over hide. I have to point out, though, that being in such a small country where with so much constraints on our countrysides, where we have to share the bird watching, the bird photography, and the bird hunting in such a small space, that being too camouflaged might be a bit risky. So one has to be careful. find a compromise, because being too well hidden, even for other people, especially if you are somewhere that is open for hunting, it might become a little bit of a problem, because obviously first things first, and safety comes above all other things. Therefore, one has to be very careful where to use such hides. As I said, with all the different aspects impacting on our countryside. When to go out? Basically, I'm going to now focus on different aspects regarding bird photography in Malta, and I want to start with the when. When to go out, the time of year, because there is also the issue of time. But at the moment, I'm going to focus on the time of year. Basically, we have 4 different types of categories of birds. We have the migrating birds that visit us only during migration. We are actually at the peak of the autumn migration at the moment for certain species. And we have a number of bird species that we can enjoy only during a specific period of time throughout the year. Then we have the breeding birds, those birds species that breed here in Malta. It doesn't mean that they spend the whole year with us. As you can see, the 4th point over there, it's resident birds. Obviously, the resident birds also breed here with us, but we also have other species that, although they breed with us, they do not spend the year, the whole 12 months with us. They come over, they breed, and then they migrate to spend the winter in Africa. Then we have the wintering birds, which are basically the birds that do not spend the breeding season here with us, but they come over after the breeding season. Most of them, basically all of them, but let's say most of them, spend the winter in Europe, and then they visit us for the winter, because obviously our winter is much milder than the winter high up north. One of the bird species that can be classified as a migrating bird species is obviously the honey buzzard. The honey buzzard, we're watching a juvenile honey buzzard at the moment. They are very common in September and also in spring, in around May. But usually, if you are in bird photography rather than bird watching, there is a great difference between the 2 periods. Why? Because at this time of year, most of the honey buzzards visiting Malta are juvenile birds, like the one we are seeing over here. You'd know that they are juvenile from their plumage. They will have a yellow cere, which is basically the fleshy part of the beak over here. It is yellow. In adults, it is they have an all black beak, and the eyes are dark in juveniles. When they get older, especially in males, they become yellowed eyes. And during autumn, we get honey buzzards, especially around Dingley, in the Dingley area. In spring, they tend to scatter around, especially in lowland Malta, when they have more open space. And as I said, apart from going to different places, they also offer a different photo opportunity, because they look completely different. We only get a very few amount of adult honey buzzards in autumn, but in spring, basically, the majority are adult birds. They look different, so they give a different photo opportunity for the bird photographer. Then I mentioned breeding birds. The one that we're seeing at the moment is the little ringed plover. It is one of the breeding birds. It breeds exclusively at Adira Nature Reserve, but we can't enjoy this particular species throughout the year. It arrives in early spring, it breeds with us, and then after the breeding season, the birds migrate over to Africa. And then we'll have to wait to the next breeding season to be in their graceful presence. Wintering birds. One of the most common wintering birds is the white wagtail. It's Sakakabiat. We don't have this bird as a breeding bird, so during spring we will not be able to enjoy this particular bird. But during the winter months, we get these in thousands. And there is a very interesting fact about this particular species, because They tend to scatter all around Malta during the day, but they all, or basically most of these birds, group to roost in Valletta. So basically, if you go in front of our law courts in winter and you look in the ficus trees opposite the law courts, you will be able to witness a magnificent event. If you go just after the sunset, thousands of these birds join in and they all fight for that particular comfortable twig where to spend the night. Then in the morning, from there, they scatter all around the island in order to feed and basically to their normal their normal things. Then we have the resident birds, those bird species that breed with us and also remain here with us. This is one of the lesser common warbler species, the spectacled warbler. This is not as common as the Sardinian warbler, the Bovula seuda, which breeds in even in urban areas. This is found only in rural areas, especially in open garrigue areas. This particular photo was, for example, taken in Maestral area. In the south, it's found in Shrop Lagine area and Munshar area, but it is not as common as the Bovula seuda, the Sardinian warbler, which is much more common because it tends to be common even in urban gardens. Where to go? It's very, very important to plan your bird photographic sessions. Why? Because if you, let's stick to an example that I already mentioned, if you want to get a good chance of photographing a honey buzzard in autumn, you shouldn't go to the airport area, for example, but you should go to Dingley. Why? Because that is the area where they gather, especially in the afternoon, where they gather to roost. If you go in the same area during the spring, even though you'd be looking for the same species, most probably you will not see any. Why? Because at that particular time of year, they seek other areas of our island. So it is always good to refer to a bird guide, a local bird guide, which suggests where to go and when, because it makes a great difference. Obviously, if you want to photograph waders, those birds who prefer shallow water, obviously you are not going to Busquet. But if you want to photograph, for example, birds that are fond of trees, you still don't go to Busquet regardless of the, for example, weather conditions. Why? Because if the wind is blowing very strongly from a particular direction, certain woodlands might be more exposed than others. Therefore, choosing which woodland to go, for example, because obviously birds prefer more sheltered area when they are migrating, for example, because it's easier to find food, it's less demanding to fly around. They tend to find sheltered areas. So choosing a good spot is usually the initial step, initial decision that you need to make before any bird photography session. Be careful where to go, and there's no a single suggestion what to do. But why? Because there are so many things that you need to be careful about. For example, when I took this particular photo, I was at a change. I rarely go to Gozo, if not for a particular sighting of a bird. When I took this photo, I went to the area because there was a particular bird species, a Musier restart, which is very rare in Malta, and I still didn't have an image of a female Musier restaurant. And this one that was present in the area, it was a female Musier restart. When you are looking at something that you've been waiting for a number of years, it might be very tempting to try to approach and to forget anything that's all around you. Certain bird species are found in dangerous areas. So it's always very important not to focus only on what you are viewing from your viewfinder. Because if you focus exclusively on what you're seeing from your camera, You might start approaching, for example, a cliff. You might start approaching even a rubble wall. You might end up either damaging your equipment, or even worse, you might end up in a personally dangerous situation. Be also careful where to go. Yes, Vince?
Aron, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
Maybe you could mention the birds' names in Maltese as well, so that
Okay. Yes. Yes. So
yeah,
the honey buzzard, the one that I mentioned for a number of times, is the cucciarda. The
okay.
honey buzzard is the cucciarda. Then I mentioned the white wagtail, the ones that they go and roost in Valletta. Is the tzakak abiat. It's how many jgħidlu? Tzakak abiat. Then there is the bufula hamra, the Sardinian warbler. The Sardinian warbler hija il-bufula hamra. I will mention the bird names both in Maltese and in English from now on. Well, now, as regards getting close to your subject, it's very important, especially when your subject is about 10 centimeters, including tail and beak, by the way, which is obviously not an easy task to capture at a close range, especially when we are dealing with birds, because sometimes even a butterfly might be challenging to approach, let alone a bird. So being well concealed is very important, but it is even more important not to get close and that's it, but to get close and be basically, you try to be as invisible as possible. Why? Because if you get close and the bird is aware that you are there, it will not relax. So the posture would not be natural. The bird that we're seeing here, the sitting testicola, il-bufula tal-imrewħa, because it tends to open its tail when it's flying and when it alights on a twig. It is a bird species, a resident bird that we can enjoy throughout the year, that is rather tricky to approach. So the best thing to do sometimes, rather than approaching directly a bird, it might be a better idea if you scout an area using a binocular, because these are resident birds, so they will have their patch. You take note of where they are residing, because usually they do have a favorite perch. You approach the perch, you conceal yourself, and then you wait for the bird to come. Because when it's the bird that comes closer rather than the other way around, the outcome usually is much more successful. It is a solitary practice. I work in a school. I'm constantly surrounded by a crowd, basically. Therefore, I seek some solitary time, but sometimes the waiting time is quite long. But when you manage to get a species like the bee eater we're seeing now over at the moment, el-ertin nahal, at a close range, you will be reminded why you are alone. Even if you are in two, it's already twice as difficult to elude a bird to come closer. Being on your own, it's already challenging to get close to a bird. Being in two, it's at least twice as difficult. So obviously, I would suggest that if possible, try to be alone in order to get good close-up views of birds that are alighted, not in flight, because it's okay when you are trying to shoot obviously with a camera, a honey buzzard, a cucciarda in flight. It doesn't matter if you're in 2 or 3, but if you are trying to get a good close-up view of maybe a honey buzzard alighted on top of a tree, being alone, it's already a difficult task. In Maltese, we have a saying, "Għandu għajnejh ta' seqer." It has a falcon's eyesight. So obviously, if they can see a lizard, obviously they will be able to see us, but they might not be hindered by our presence if you are not in a crowd, especially if you are alone and you don't move around, you hide your face. you might be able to get such a views. Why did I choose this particular photo? Because I took this photo not in a height, but simply behind a rubble wall. This photo was taken when I was behind a rubble wall. I studied where a flock of bee-eaters were trying to catch moths and butterflies and dragonflies and bees and wasps and even the hornets that were flying around. And as I said, since they tend to have favorite perches, I hid myself behind a wall close to the place they were alighting. And after some time, I was lucky and managed to get a number of shots, including the one we're seeing now. I don't know if you're listening to this particular song. It is the Settis Warbler, Il-Bufula tal-Olle. Most probably, this is the song you would hear if you go walking down Wiet il-Luq in Busquet. It is much easier to be aware of the presence of this particular bird by first listening to it rather than by managing to spot this particular bird. It tends to hide itself in the vegetation. So using your ears is also important. It's not just looking for birds. Listening is an essential part of bird photography because very often you would be aware of the presence of a bird species thanks to its call rather than thanks to its visual presence. Using your ears is also helpful when it comes to identifying the bird species that you are dealing with. Here are two different species. They look very similar. Only the keen bird watcher most probably would be able to identify the two species, but if you listen to their call, you would be able to identify which species it is because they have quite distinctive calls. For example, this one. It is the meadow pipit, Il-Pespus pespisa. This is the one, the species, Il-Pespus. The other one is the diz, the tree pipit, Dizzu. And as I said, it has a totally different call. So this is the tree pipit, the Dizzu. This is the Pespus. Therefore, using your ears would also help you identify which species you managed to capture, basically, which in my opinion is very rewarding because you'd be satisfied not just with the capture, with the visual, but also with the knowledge of knowing what you managed to capture. Excuse me. Now, making your life a little bit easier. Obviously, in Malta, we have quite a lot of adversities when it comes to bird watching. So trying to make your life a little bit easier is surely no sin. This particular photo you are watching at the moment has some cheating in it. Why? Because I chose a hollow trunk, basically. I filled the trunk with food. That tree trunk over there, it's full of seeds. But I set at an angle which didn't expose the presence of the seed, so as to make the capture more natural. So, being a bit wise doesn't mean that you are cheating, in my opinion, because you are simply providing food to a bird without changing its wild state. In my opinion, providing regular food, apart from you as a photographer having more opportunities of capturing close-ups, you would also help the birds, especially during the winter months when the availability of food tends to get scarcer. So it's a mutual benefit situation because the bird would be having a regular food supply, and obviously you would be getting much more photographic opportunities. Providing water. You can use, for example, a plant base and fill it with water and wait for birds to come over to have a bath and to drink, but that would not look nice in a photo. So what I do, I take a couple of water bottles with me. I try to find a depression where to pour the water. The water you're seeing over there was basically a 2-liter mineral water container, which I poured in a good spot. When I say good spot, obviously I make sure that the light is okay in the area, blah, blah, blah. But then if I'm successful, the bird would appear in a much better setting than wading in a plant spot. So these are little things that might do the trick when it comes to bird photography, especially when considering that from March onwards, basically, all our countryside lacks fresh water. But the birds would be in full swing during migration, and they would appreciate water even more than food. So I suggest that you provide, yes, fresh water, even in small amounts. As you can see now, at the moment, you are watching a yellow wagtail isfar in Maltese, who named this bird wasn't that creative. Isfar, I just mentioned its color. And it's still a bird in its natural environment. It's still in the wild. You're not cheating whatsoever. You're simply providing a better environment, micro habitat, in which you might increase the opportunity of capturing a close-up such as this one. Providing a variety of exposed perches. What do I mean by exposed perches? They need to be at the correct, at the ideal distance from your position. Why? For example, my 400 prime lens has a minimum focal length of 3.5 meters. So providing a twig which is closer to that distance would not serve its purpose, because I will not be able to take a photo at that distance. Even the orientation of the twig makes a difference. Certain birds prefer twigs that are horizontally placed. Others prefer vertical twigs. For example, this one over here, the chifchaf, Violeta shitwa, because it's very common during the winter months. So basically, they named this Violeta shitwa because you have a similar species, Violin safrani, which visit us during spring and autumn. So basically, this particular species prefer very thin twigs, twin branches, and when they are placed horizontally, they prefer them even better. There are other species, for example, the reed warbler, which prefers reeds. So something vertical is much more attractive to them than horizontal branches. If you are trying to attract bigger species, obviously you need to be closer to thicker branches. This species over here, the Eurasian hobby, Is-Seqer tal-Ħannieqa, is very fond of places from where it can have a 360 view of its surroundings. Why? Because these falcons, they eat birds in flight, bats in flight, especially during the last hours of the day and the last minutes of the day, and therefore they prefer these clear and exposed branches from where they can scan the area, and therefore concealing yourself close to a good branch basically increases the chance of having one such bird decide to alight close to your area, and if you're lucky and you're concealed enough, spend just like this hobby did, a couple of minutes screening in front of you. It's also very important to have unobstructed angles, because sometimes you might end up in a position where you would have a very limited angle, a clean angle. The angle from where you can work is crucial. Why? Because you can't ask a bird to move a little bit forward or backwards. You have to anticipate, to think in advance, to plan in advance, so as to increase the chance of having an unobstructed view of your subject. Therefore, if you are aware that species such as the common snipe, in Maltese, the common snipe, is is a species that avoids remaining in the open, coming out in the open. Therefore, if you want to get a good view of it, you need to find somewhere where there is vegetation. But too much vegetation would obviously make it impossible to get a good photo opportunity. Therefore, trying to find an opening in the vegetation, such as the example shared here, it would make it possible to get this particularly shy species exposed enough to get that instance where you can grab a couple of shots. Photographic birds in flight. This is a particularly interesting challenge in bird photography because there are quite a lot of things that you have to be aware of. For example, the wind's direction. Many birds prefer to fly against the wind. So when you are facing the wind, if a bird is coming your way, most probably it's going to fly too fast to capture. Why? Because the birds prefer to fly, as I said, against the wind. And when they are flying against the wind, since they are calmer, they are more in control, they fly at a much slower pace, giving you more time to frame and shoot. If you are obviously taking care of the wind, you can neglect the position of the sun. Because even though you might be facing the best angle as regards wind, if you are facing the sun, obviously all your photos would not show any detail of your subjects. Notice any patterns. Usually when birds start coming in, especially during migration, they tend to show patterns. For example, out of 10, 8 might all pass from a particular area. And you might start wondering, of all this open space, how come they are all flying through that particular channel, from that particular opening? It could be that there is a particular air current that is favoring the birds, and therefore they tend to prefer that particular area, which for you has nothing better than the area you are in. But if you notice these patterns, you will be able to anticipate, move to that area, and if lucky enough to have more birds coming your way, you would be in a better position to capture. Be aware of what you're shooting against. Are you shooting against the sky, against the trees, against the sea? They all tend to give a different challenge to the photographer as regards the setting. If you're shooting against the sky, for example, usually as regards the focal point, I set it to the whole sensor because it's very easy for the camera to capture the subject, to identify the subject against a clear sky. But if you're shooting against, for example, tree canopies, if you're in Busquet, and the bird is so low that it's flying against the tree canopies, if you allow the camera to use all the sensors, the focal point would most probably will not be your bird, but the tree canopies. Therefore, you should be aware of your backdrop, and also mention it. Try to be a step ahead. You will not be given a second chance when it comes to birds. If you lose your chance, you will basically lose that moment. You might have a similar moment, but obviously will not get that same chance. There are also challenges when you are photographing birds in flight when it comes to very dark for birds, very dark photographic subjects. For example, if you look at a swift with your bare eyes, without a binocular, most probably you will see an all-black bird flying against the sky. Therefore, waiting for that particular angle that exposes the different shades of dark brown that characterize this particular species would obviously make your capture much more interesting than capturing basically silhouette of a swift. As I said, being so dark, it's very difficult to get that exact angle that exposes these shades. But basically, these are common, very common birds, the swifts, the rundun, and therefore, if you're not lucky at the first attempt, you should have more chances to get a better shot of these birds. The agret abbiat, the little egret. This is a bird that poses a similar challenge as the common swift, but at the other extreme. Having an all-white bird, especially when it is flying against, for example, a dark background or reeds, such as in this case, it is very, very easy to have overexposed captures. And therefore, finding the right balance between shutter speed and uh, light reading, light measurement is sometimes very tricky, especially when you won't have time to prepare for the capture. Usually I have a couple of settings that I switch from one to another when it comes to flight capturing birds in flight, because when it comes to birds in flight, shutter speed is a must. You can't slow down more than 1/1000th of a second when you have a bird in flight. And therefore sometimes you have to sacrifice, for example, ISO in order to retain a certain speed and obviously retaining a good light metering. Sometimes you have, as I said, competition from the background. This particular photo, the Reddit Turnstone in Monacella Imperiali, I shot this particular photo in Marsa Scala. This particular photo was shot using the center focal point, just one focal point. Because when I tried to use the central area, the 9-point focal point, which gives you a better chance to find your bird, but it was the background was so competitive for the camera, it kept capturing the background as my focal area. So I had to switch. Today's camera, as you all know, usually have a trigger switch that you can switch from one focal autofocus point to another without having to let go of your framing. And I was lucky enough to switch to the single point focal mode and eventually capturing this particular photo. Then there is the challenge of the fast flying bird species. This is the gamema, the turtle dove. Usually it's a very hot potato when it comes to local politics because it is one of the species, a controversial species, because its numbers in our area are constantly decreasing. I'm not going to get into any issue regarding hunting, no hunting, etc. But I'm just going to mention the fact that this is a thrill for the hunter because of its habit of flushing out of its roots, of its perch, of the ground, and it is a difficult bird to find and shoot, let alone to capture on a photograph. So the reward, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, sure.
We've got a question. Maybe I'm not sure if you've already said the settings already, but can you repeat them in that case? What speed and what ISO do you use?
No, my primary lens is the 400 f5.6, which is a limited. It gives me a number of limitations. For example, as regards the ISO, when it comes to birds in flight, usually I don't go lower than ISO 400 because when it comes to birds in flight, as I said, the minimum is 1/1000 usually of a second. But it depends also on the bird species. If we are talking about a turtle dove, gamema, such as the one that we are watching at the moment, it is extremely fast. So anything less than 1/1600, 1/1200 will surely become unusable because there is a great difference in how as regards the way birds fly. When it comes to setting, usually I set it either to shutter priority or to aperture priority. When I have good light, usually I tend to set it to aperture priority with my lens, I prefer to use the 6.3 aperture. It gives a quite satisfactory uh, product outcome. But when it comes to fast moving, I obviously get to 5.6 and I switch to shutter priority. When I'm out, for example, taking photos of birds that are fast flyers, that like the swift, the rundun, the turtle dove, usually I prefer shutter priority, not less than 1/2000 of a second, and I usually sacrifice the ISO, not to compromise the shutter speed, as otherwise it would be very difficult to get that sharp capture. On the other hand, there are birds that are very slow moving, such as the one we're watching at the moment, the grey heron. When you are taking photo of slow moving large subjects, then I can, for example, go up to f8 and even higher. Why? Because if you are using f8, most probably you will get an opportunity to capture a bird where with the wingtips and the eyes fully focused. And also you can afford, because they will give you time, because they, as I said, will be moving very slowly. Therefore, a shutter speed of around 1/1000 of a second would be more than enough to capture the photo that we're watching at the moment. There is the species that you're trying to capture gives a totally different scenario to the bird photographer, because as I said, you have slow moving species such as the herons, the one that we're watching now, that allows you to slow the shutter, and obviously then you have the opportunity to go up to, let's say, a fate and even higher. But species such as the turtle dove, the one that I showed you before, will leave you with no choice but to stick to a fast shutter and sacrifice all the rest, basically. And then obviously there is the opportunity to capture huge flocks. When it comes to huge flocks, usually I prefer not to go lower than f8, so as to get as much subjects in focus as possible. If I shot this particular photo, for example, using f5.6, most probably I would have just a limited number of seagulls that are fully focused, with all the rest of the image obviously losing for. But I wanted to capture the whole flock as much as possible within the focal range, and therefore I slowed a bit the shutter and opted for this kind of setting. Usually I prefer also a short depth of field setting, so as to enhance the importance given to my subject. But in cases such as the example over here, the fact that I have aura point in the background over there, not totally out of focus, they've put the image in a context. I wanted the viewer to have an idea where the photo was taken, and therefore I usually switch between aperture priority and shutter priority depending on the message I want to convey. Now I'm going to switch to the habitat issues. The habitat is crucial when it comes to the species that we tend to find in a particular area. Therefore, I'm going to mention a number of habitats that we can all enjoy in our country, and mention a couple of species in each that you might encounter in these particular habitats. The urban folk, our urban areas. Obviously, I had to start with the most common species, the Spanish sparrow, which it is very often overlooked. The male Spanish sparrow, the one we're watching that features in this particular photo, is quite a colorful species actually. It also gives you the opportunity to capture it in different plumages. For example, this, as you can verify from the presence of one egg over here in the nest, this particular species doesn't have a black beak throughout the year. during winter, the beak becomes much more yellow. The black on its breast becomes much less obvious. Even the brightness of the rest of its body. So capturing the bird in different in different seasons throughout the year gives you the opportunity even to compare the same species through the different stages it passed through. And it also provides quite a number of photographic opportunities because it's quite charmful. It's usually not afraid of us, and therefore it is a very good species to practice with. I already mentioned the importance of the presence of fresh water. Over here, we can see father and son of a father and son photo, a male sparrow with one of its juvenile fledglings. It has the yellow cere. The yellow fleshy part at the end of the beak that is visible over here, that is a sign that that is a young bird just fled from the nest. It is very important for the young birds, that yellow part, because it's known to stimulate the parents when it comes to feeding. When they open their mouth and the other birds see that's here, it simulates them to go out, get food, and come back again with their food in order to feed the young. The female is obviously much less colorful than the male when it comes to the Spanish sparrow, that's poor talbate, but it is still an interesting subject, especially round about January, February, when they are planning to raise a family, because building the process of nest building usually gives you ample opportunities to get instances when they might be carrying, for example, a twig which is 3 times as big as they are, and then they do not manage to fit it in the hole in which they are building their nest. So it's basically a very interesting time of year when to go out for this particular species. Obviously, the male, as I said, is quite much more attractive. Obviously, the vegetation present in the area might give you ample opportunity to experiment with. And obviously, then there is the Sardinian warbler, the Bufula seuda, which is another common bird species. It's found even in smaller gardens, urban gardens. This is the male, the Bufula seuda Sardinian warbler, that is characterized by a grayish overall plumage and a dark cap. The female is much browner with a grayish head. Then we have the white wagtail. I already mentioned the white wagtail, the Sacacabiat, the species that roosts in hundreds in front of our law courts and in front of St. John's Cathedral. The black redstart is another common wintering species. And I'm mentioning these species because they tend to be wide confining. This photo was taken whilst walking towards the main gate at the Ali National Park. This is one of the archways, metal archways. When you're getting through the drive-in, you will realize that there are these metal archways with some ivy creeping up. This was basically on one of these archways, and it was not bothered at all by the presence of quite a lot of people walking around. And obviously, it gave me the opportunity to just stand up, walk towards the bird, as I said, with the camera in front of my face and the cap, wearing a cap not to expose my face, and it was not bothered at all by my presence. This is the female, this is the male, and this is the female black redstart. Then we have the starlings, Listournelle, that is also very common throughout the wintering months. And they tend to congregate in very large numbers. If you want to see such a view, I suggest you wait another couple of weeks, and then you visit the Runways Airport, where they tend to gather in huge flocks in the area. Then there is also the barn swallow, which is a challenge to capture in flight, but even alighted, when it's alighted on a twig or on a wire. Why? Because it tends to come out on a photo capture, it tends to come out as a black plumage bird. But if you get a good angle, its glossy plumage is quite attractive. In my opinion, it's a very attractive bird, especially if you manage to capture a good angle that exposes its glossy nature. This is the barn swallow in flight. Then we have the collar dove, which is also a common breeding bird. It was very rare up till about 15 years ago, but now it colonized our islands, and we're getting quite a lot of collar doves even in our urban areas. Then there are other species that are fond of our woodland, even though they're limited. Our woodland presents very important habitat to our birds, the birds visiting us, even apart from the ones, the resident birds, even those visiting us during migration. The goat crest, this one over here, is the smallest bird species that you can see in all Europe. This is the smallest species that you can get, the Bufula tal-Amar. We have a similar species, the firecrest, which has a different facial pattern, but otherwise it's practically almost identical. This particular photo was taken at Kennedy Grove. There were quite a lot of picnickers in the area. These birds are also not bothered by human presence. I tried to select species for this particular part of the presentation that are quite easy to get close to, even without a hide, even without concealing yourself. Most of these birds, they're quite confining. The willow warbler, another common species that you can enjoy in our woodland areas. The song thrush, this is quite a timid species, especially because it is very targeted by hunters. Therefore, obviously, when it starts associating with people with pom-pom, usually its reaction is to start becoming quite timid. And then there's the siskin, one of the birds of songbirds, La Sapartalana lekru, that is sought a lot by local trappers. And there are other birds that are practically impossible to see in our woodland areas because they prefer open spaces. I refer to them as the claustrophobic. If you want to see these species, you have to go to places such as Maestral, Shrop Lagine Parks, walk around Ammir, open spaces. Avoid trees if you want to see these particular species. For example, the Alouetta, the skylark. It's practically impossible to see these species in around Muscat or Foresta 2000 or Mizziep. You have to go to open spaces. The meadow pipit, the dotterel, the berwina. These are all birds that you can enjoy if you go to open areas. The wheat here. Then there are the seabirds. During the winter, when the migration is over, usually the number of species that we can enjoy is much less. But the number of seabirds that come closer to our shore because of bad weather out at sea increases. Therefore, during the winter months, finding a close, a sheltered part of shoreline and try to wait for good close-ups of seabirds is a suggestion that I would make, especially if it is a very windy day, because the stronger the wind, the closer these birds tend to get to our shores. This is the chirlewa, which is not a gull, it is a tern, black tern. It is different from gulls at a first glance because it has a much sleeker, thinner wing profile. Even the beak is much thinner and much longer, and the tail is also almost swallow-like, much thinner. This is one of the birds that visits our shore during migration. Sandwich terns are much commoner than the other one, and they tend to be around throughout the winter. As you can see from this photo, the profile is quite different from that of a gull, even though many people confuse the two categories. Then we have the very common yellow-legged gulls. This is the largest breeding bird species that we have in our islands, Ilgawia prima. They are very common around Alice. The Sikka il-sikka li hemm l-adira s-safra. When you are driving along the coast road, there is that reef over there, the sikka s-safra, and they usually these birds they gather there in sometimes in hundreds. And as I said, they're also very common in Salina. Then this is the black-headed gull, one of the commonest gulls we have throughout winter. We usually do not see this gull in its summer plumage. Over here, you can watch. You can see the breeding plumage, the black-headed gull, when it has a black head. But the vast majority of the black-headed gulls we see in Malta do not have a full black head, but they have just a dark black dot behind the ear, because this is the winter plumage. They have a black head only during the breeding season. This particular photo was taken in Marsaxlokk. Then we have the Mediterranean gull, which at the first glance is very similar to the black-headed gull, but if you notice, the black-headed gull has black primaries. Il-pinna hawnhekk, they are all black, even in the other photo. As you can see, they are black. The Mediterranean gull, even though it's similar, the adult has an all-white wing pattern. And when you start becoming familiar with these species, apart from trying to capture the shot that you're interested in, you start appreciating more the difference between the species. As I've said in the beginning, a good bird guide obviously helps you identify much easier and quicker. We also have another breeding species that is very common around our islands, but it's difficult to get ashore. The Chifa, the Scopolis, Shearwater. If you have a boat and you go out at sea in July, around July, you will manage to enjoy hundreds, especially later in the day when it's sunset is approaching, because they tend to congregate in large numbers, waiting for dusk. When it becomes dark, they go to their nest to feed their young, because these birds, they spend all the day out at sea looking for food. They fill their crop. When it's dark enough to go to their nest, they go to their nest, they regurgitate, they itallaw, the food to their young. Their young will be able to feed from that food, and they will be free to go out at sea again to look for more food. But they are practically not visible from what will from ashore. You have to go out at sea, even on a small boat, a couple of kilometers out, and you will see hundreds of these birds. Now, shoreline fanciers, these are birds that prefer shoreline rather than open sea, shallow water. In English, they are called waders. We have quite a lot of different species, but unfortunately, we don't have a lot of areas where we can enjoy them. So areas such as Adira, Salina, the small cove at Mistra, these are the limited sections of shorelines where we can enjoy these birds. And we have quite a lot of species, as I said, that visit us. Some of them in very good numbers. Some of them are very common. Others, such as this one, the grey plover, they are not that common. But you can never be aware of when you're going to meet one. For example, yesterday there was one grey plover at Golden Bay. It was very tame. It didn't mind the presence of people going around it. So even though it's not common, it's not impossible to get the opportunity, if you go out and about, to get views of even scarce species. As I said, some of them might turn out to be extremely tame. The one that I mentioned, for example, it was yesterday or 2 days ago at Jnejna, because I didn't manage to go there and see it, with people looking at it, taking photos of it with their mobiles. So sometimes you might turn a very good photographic opportunity might turn out to be in the least expected location. And I'm going through the species. Yeah.
Sorry, Aron, we've got a question from Tony Azzopardi.
Yeah.
Good evening. I hope the music is not interfering. Let me put it down a bit. Good evening,
Good evening.
Aaron. It's the
Good
first
evening,
time.
Tony.
It's the first time I'm saying hello to you, and this is very interesting. Unfortunately, I had a bad need of sleep, and I had to sleep. I came in a bit late. I will watch it later on YouTube. Uh, First of all, you're very well informed and very bravo. Prosit. And how difficult is it using such a long lens with such a small bird to capture it properly in the frame? I mean, while it's moving fast. Aaron, I think you have to be prepared. You have to be well prepared and well into the subject.
Tony, I suggest that if somebody is interested in this kind of photography, the first thing to do is practice with common species. Don't mind the species. Don't mind that it's a pigeon. Don't mind that the
Yeah.
first 100, 200 photos you're going to take are not going to be used, even though sometimes a capture of a pigeon taking into the air still might turns out to be a very interesting capture. But obviously, if you're interested in the species, you have to ideally be prepared, photographically speaking, get ready by practicing on much commoner species, as I said, on Spanish sparrows, pigeons, warblers, which gives you more than one opportunity. Why? Because sometimes you end up waiting for, let's say, 1 hour, 2 hours for that particular moment. And then if you're not prepared enough, you might end up disillusioned because the output, the capture, is not what you intended. But spending a couple of weeks shooting pigeons, shooting photographically speaking, obviously, okay, capturing pigeons, capturing sparrows, and comparing settings. Usually, when I get a new, for example, lens, a new body, I tend to use different settings so as to become aware what is the limit of your equipment. For example, sometimes I would love go down to, let's say, ISO 200 to capture a better quality shot. But if I'm shooting a bird in flight, experience showed me that if I go down to 200, if I don't have perfect lighting conditions, I will not have a pin sharp image. Therefore, I learned to sacrifice my ISO in order to achieve the desired shutter speed. But it took me quite a while, even though I am familiar with the birds, even though I am familiar with the photographic skills. When I changed a lens, when I changed a body, I realized that certain settings that applied for my previous lens do not hold for the current equipment. So I suggest that, first of all, one starts to get familiar with finding your subject, because when you are zoomed in, it's very challenging to find your subject. That is one of the main issues, finding your subject, the bird.
Of course, because you have a much smaller
Smaller
area,
scope. The scope, yeah, is much limited when compared,
view.
obviously, to other lenses. Using a telephoto lens, you need to get used to finding your subject in movement, anticipate, because if the bird is flying and you put up against your the viewfinder, facing the bird, not in front of it, most probably you won't see anything in your viewfinder. Why? Because the bird has already passed that area. So it's basically just as a shooter with a rifle trains in order to uh, learn the kit, learn the gear, and learn the skills, how to anticipate, how to move with your subject. I think that is the best way how to approach this kind of photography. I can't tell you how many hundreds of images I've got of sparrows, pigeons, you name it, so as to keep up, to keep alert, to keep up your skill as regards finding the bird, anticipating its moves, and also switching from one setting to another, ideally without removing the camera off your face. Because sometimes if you remove the camera of your face, for example, to change the focal point option selection, it would be too late to get a decent shot. Why? Because the bird is either flying or walking. It rarely keeps still for more than, let's say, 1-2 minutes. So yes, you have to first of all try to get to know your kit, and also try to get the skills required to capture a bird in the limited scope available. Yes, I strongly suggest. I
Thank
would
you. Thank
suggest,
you.
for example, places such as Salina. If you go to Salina, most probably you will find something to capture. Seagulls are constantly there, little egrets are constantly there. Usually there are waders such as this one over here, the careless sandpiper. During migration, if it's not the careless sandpiper, you'll get the common sandpiper, which is much more common. Little ringed toppers. For example, this week there were about 4 or 5 waders similar to the one that you're seeing at the moment, and they were quite confining. So if you sit down, you take a small stool, you sit down and you wait. Obviously, you first, I suggest you go in one of the hides, for example, a Salina, you scan using the binoculars to check where are the areas where they are spending most of their time, because usually they have favorite spots. And then you go, you sit down and you wait for the birds to come again to feed in that particular area. And then you will start realizing what are the limits, both yours as a photographer and also the limits of your kit as regards this kind of photography. And then I would start suggesting trying to tackle more difficult species, especially as I said, since certain species require a longer waiting time. If you're not up to the level where you are happy with your captures, waiting for 2 hours and then end up ruining the fun because you are not happy with the result, it might spoil the fun and discourage you from carrying on in this particular kind of photography. So I suggest, yes, if you live somewhere where you have pigeons flying around, why not try to capture some good images where the image, the plumage in flight is well defined, where it is sharp, and then you move on to sparrows, and then you might visit Salina for gulls, little eagles, etc. And then you venture to other areas.
And I think, like every subject, that being passionate about the subject, like you are about birds, and they're well informed, that helps a lot. Yeah.
It helps, but
Yes.
if you are not well informed, I was not well informed as regards photography. I was well informed as regards birds since I was 4 years old.
All
But
right.
when I made the switch to photography, there were instances where I was going to be too discouraged and I was going to stop. Why? Because it's not easy. You have to
No, it's not.
learn.
It's not
You
at all.
have to
No.
learn quite a lot of things.
Mhm.
I didn't know anything about photography. I started learning slowly, gradually, but I try to set fixed targets. If you try to get the most difficult species immediately, you might end up discouraged because it might be too much for somebody who's not familiar with birds, for example. Being familiar with your photographic equipment doesn't mean that you know your photographic equipment's limitations when it comes to this kind of photography. So I would suggest trying to capture, for example, a little egret in flight, an all-white bird in flight, and see whether you are able to get a good photo as regards the shades of white, etc. Why? Because if you end up facing a great white egret, which is most probably a very rare occurrence, if you are not up to the level that you wish, you might get discouraged and therefore you might end up stop trying to get better bird photographic shots. Therefore, I suggest that you set targets to yourself, realistic targets, and then things would gradually guide you basically through.
Okay. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Tony.
You're
Thank you.
welcome. You're welcome.
It's a fascinating lecture. Thank you. I'm gonna mute myself.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for your
Thank
comment.
you.
Um,
Thank you.
Aaron, I have a
Yep.
question. I
Yep.
have two questions actually. One is how do you determine whether to crop, where actually to crop a large bird that is bigger than a frame? That is my first question. And my second question is how much research do you do on the birds before you go to photograph them for the first time, being a new bird, for example, a new species? Do you know them intimately first, or just does it depend on the particular species?
Now, as regards the first question, cropping a bird, usually I crop a bird when I want to focus on a particular feature of the bird. For example, my images are frequently used in educational material. Sometimes I, for example, want to focus on the beak of a bird, its eyes, its back. If you can, if you have the possibility to crop, to avoid certain areas, for example, let's take this image, for example, Vince. If I want you to focus on the beak, I would crop its legs. Why? Because being so colorful as compared to the rest of the bird and being so large as compared to the size of the bird, most probably, if you are watching this photo, most probably your eyes would fall on its legs, not on its beak. Therefore, if you would convey a message, I would, yes, crop. Otherwise, I prefer to leave the bird fully in short. But as I said, sometimes the setting or the aim of the image is to convey a message. For example, last week I had the opportunity to get a good shot of a Scops owl. This Scops owl is an owl that is very difficult to see, but once you manage to see one, it's very confining. It doesn't fly off very easily. It allows you to get closer, but there was a branch in front of this owl. Now, if for me to get a clean shot, I either had to get too close to it with the risk of flushing it, and I didn't want it to be afraid of me and go somewhere else, because where it was a safe place, and I wanted it to remain there. Therefore, I had to compromise. And in order to get a good, a satisfactory shot, I cropped the image, not because I wanted to exclude part of my owl, but I wanted to exclude that particular twig that was in the way of getting a good shot. So basically, I try as much as possible to leave the whole bird visible, but cropping it if usually I have more than one image of that bird. For example, if I have a publication where I have two images of the same bird, usually I would crop one as an extreme close-up, so as to, for example, if I have a robin, I would focus on its chest to expose the most characteristic part of the species, but only if I have the opportunity to include another image in which it features in its entirety. And as regards knowledge about birds, I know quite a lot about birds, but I always feel that I do not know enough. Why? Because they are a living thing. They are something that keeps adapting to your to our for example rural state of rural Malta. For example, up till 7, 8, 10 years ago, if you went to Salina, you would not have seen more than a dozen of gulls. Nowadays, if you go, it could be enough. There could be a flock of, let's say, 200, 300 of them. Why? Because the place is now secure, they have security on watch, and therefore it changed. Knowing the place, knowing the bird, and also knowing when and where to go is something either to seek in a bird guide, and we have quite a number of local publications that suggest where to go and when to go. And also, when you start taking photos, I frequently refer to my image database to check out which were the species that I photographed in a particular month. For example, the year before, in previous years. As you all know, you can sort your images by date taken, by name, by size. I frequently sort them by date taken so as to look for that particular month to be aware which were the species that I encountered in the previous years. And it gives you an idea of what was around, and that should help you choose a better area where to go for future sessions. Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. If there are more questions, yes.
I'm seeing some comments actually from Paul and Noel Words. They're saying if you could suggest a good reference book for birds, a local reference book maybe for.
Can I make? I can mention it won't be some reclam and advertisement.
Sure.
If you give me 1 minute, I'll be back and I'll show you the cover because they should be available here.
No worries. So in the meantime, until Aron joins us back, I want to remind you for subsequent webinars that we will be having next week. We will be having Francis because Francis will be with us in the next set. He cannot be with us. So we've decided to move a discussion regarding the 55th National Exhibition. Correct me, Steve, right? Is that right? Sorry. Steve.
Can you repeat, Vince?
Okay. I was saying, Steve, that next week we won't be having Francis because Francis asked us he cannot make it. Due to personal exigencies. So we've decided to fit in a discussion regarding the 55th National.
Perfect. Yes.
So we will be having discussions with the winners and everything. We will give you more details when Steve and myself will discuss this.
Yeah. There are some of the winners here, including you and Johan, so you must be here.
Thank you. Okay, Aron.
Okay, again. So as regards my Bible, as regards birds, it is the I can send you the full references after the webinar. This is basically my main reference. There are two versions, the volume 1 and then they have the second edition. They are in my opinion, this particular book is the best reference as regards all the European birds. And the illustrations are very, very detailed, and you can refer to basically to it for 99.9% of the species that visit us. Local publications, there is the photographic guide, a photographic guide to the birds of Malta, which is basically quite interesting because it gives you quite a lot of information when the bird visits us and where you can go to try and find the sighting of the species. Then there is the breeding birds of Malta, which is basically very informative, but it is more restrictive because it only deals with breeding species. Therefore, it is not as comprehensive as the other two. The list is even longer. There are two that I managed to get hold of in a minute because I have even more. And if I may, there are quite a number of online bookstores that offer the list. The list I can mention, for example, ma nafxux reklam. Usually I buy. There is a particular bookshop, bookstore, BDL that you can categorize, and if you look for local publications, you can realize that along the years there were quite a lot of publications about nature and birds specific and birds and other things. And in my opinion, the first book I would go to would be this one over here as regards identifying the birds. And as I said, then you might consider this one, the photographic guide to the birds of Malta, and then obviously you can seek out more options. But if one is not fond of carrying a book around, today there is also the possibility to buy, for example, the Collins Guide for a relatively cheap price. You can buy this as an app on your phone. And apart from having all the text and illustrations, you will also have the calls of the birds. So if you are walking around and you hear a bird and you get a glimpse of it, you can also play and make sure that to check whether the call that you've just heard is actually, if it does belong to that particular species. So it's true, I mentioned printed books, but as I said, for example, this one, there is the option of buying the app instead of the book. As regards published captures, we're mentioning books. Along the years, bird photography gave me the opportunity to share my captures with in various media, calendars, books, magazines. It is very encouraging when you see your captures being presented as something that our country can offer. I am very frustrated when I hear people, locals, arguing that our country doesn't offer photographic opportunities to birdwatch, opportunities to enjoy nature. It's not true. We might not have the hundreds of flamingo that one can find in Kenya, but for example, today in Salina, there was a flamingo. So you don't need thousands of flamingo to enjoy a photographic session with such a beautiful species, bird species. Hopefully it will remain there, and those of you listening who would be interested, hopefully tomorrow it will be still there, and it could be one of the species story that you might start with. It's a juvenile flamingo. It's not as pink as one might wish it would be, but it's still a very interesting species to capture. And obviously, there is always room for improvement. Personally, I'm always eager to get better equipment, better knowledge about birds. But until then, one tries to do what he can with what is available, both as regards the presence of birds and obviously as regards the limitations presented by the equipment. So basically that was all I had to share with you. One last thing, if I may. I don't know whether this would be a reclam, but since I mentioned other publications, Stephen knows something about what I'm going to say. Should I, Stephen? Should I, Stephen?
Of course. Tell us about it.
One last slide then, one last slide. In the coming weeks, during COVID, let's start with the il puntat law from where it all evolved. During the COVID lockdown, because for me it was basically a lockdown for 2 months, more or less, I was quite frustrated because during the peak of the spring migration, I wasn't able to go out and capture more new images. Therefore, thanks to my wife's suggestion, I tried to use the images available to create something myself. For once, instead of forwarding my images to third parties to use them as they require, I thought of creating something new. And I thought of this particular publication. I try not to create a new, another bird book. I try to share 100 experiences. I chose 100 images, main images, and I try to share these images, these experiences through the images. It should be available soon. If God willing, there will be more photographic opportunity. Obviously, I always hope to get better images, because regardless how many bird images you have, you're always eager to get better images. As regards my Facebook page, I try to upload a photo a day from the photos that I take during the week, so as to give a reply to all those who say that we don't have anything. As I said, we do have stuff, and if in my very limited time I manage to capture these photos, let alone what every one of us can enjoy if we all take care or take note of what is around us. Usually, the birds are not, the presence of the birds is not obvious. Usually, we are surrounded by birds. If we don't slow down and look around, their presence usually goes unnoticed. So, I suggest that if you are out and about, and you are out and about as photographers, even though you're not out and about looking for birds, maybe if you are a little bit more careful of their presence, you might end up meters away from a warbler, from the chiffchaff, which are common birds and usually not timid, and you might start bird photography without the need for going out specifically for bird photography. Why not? That's basically all.
Aaron, thank you very much. As you can see,
Thanks to you for
you've
the
got
opportunity.
many positive comments flowing your way. The people and the audience that joined us today really enjoyed. I did too, of course, because I'm not much into bird photography, but this is really, really interesting, and I will be intrigued to try and do something.
Looking forward to see your captures, all of you.
Not as good as yours, of course, but
But you can never say, when the best opportunity might arise. As I said, you might be taking a photo shoot of something, an architectural building, and who knows? Who knows?
Sure, I'll try anyway. I'll try. There's always a start. But thank you again for being ever so kind to join us and share this very insightful lecture, I would say, regarding birds photography. I thank everyone for joining this webinar. We had a lovely crowd today, 37 joining, and thank you everyone also for participating for the poll. As regards next week, follow our promos. We will be having a very interesting to speak, but we will give you further information once Steve and myself will plan this forward. So keep safe, guys, because the virus is still with us. Okay, have a great week and see you next week, hopefully. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.